So we left off talking about Franz Fannon. So we talked about one idea from Franz Fannon, but there's a second that I want to share from this article. Oh, by the way, the article that we're specifically looking at is this is Shannon Sullivan, so it's under Sullivan. I got an email, somebody didn't know what article we were talking about last time, so I'm making sure. Ethical slippages, shattered histories, and the zebra striping of the unconscious. So is the article. So, okay. So what did we talk about for Franz Fannon so far? Look through your notes, or your article. Tell me about Franz Fannon. Yeah.
He lived in a French colonized territory, Caribbean.
Yep.
He kind of wrote about the unconscious of how he was not acting like his skin color, that he was like that the whole society was quote unquote white because of the French infiltration sort of
Yeah.
of the area.
Yeah. Anyone want to add on that? What else?
We were talking a little bit about the associations with like white and black as colors and like how they're looked at as good and bad, and then that's transferred onto skin tone.
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, these sort of, and that was, and we didn't dig as much in that as we could have. Like, we can think about just absolute categories, right? Like, the way in which we label black and white is kind of loaded. And we're going to get into whiteness today. There's a loadedness that's implied by us referring to ourselves as white, which we are not white. For those of us in the room that are white, I shouldn't have used too inclusive language there, but, So yeah, next, anything else with Franz Fannon? What about what's the thing about the, oh, go ahead.
Like black people interpret themselves as white, like in their unconscious.
Yeah.
With their conscious, they do something black, but in their unconscious as well.
Yeah. Yeah, they're unconsciously white. What does that mean? One of the more famous claims of Franz Fannon. What does that mean? To have a white unconscious. Yeah, go ahead.
To act or like have like different, to like act white because like that's the community you're in, to like fit in.
So it's how does the unconscious become white? What's Franz? Because it's a weird claim, right? So the mechanism here is kind of important. So, yeah.
It becomes white by the media and stuff that they intake, and then like stuff that they don't necessarily know that they every fails in the books and stuff that they read is black, so unconsciously they just start to believe that. Without explicitly saying it, kind of. So they just take all this media until it becomes part of their subconscious, like part of their thought process.
Yeah, exactly. So for Franz Fannon, yep, that sort of absorption of that lends people or turns black people, particularly in colonized places, to have a worldview that is implicitly one that's white, despite the fact that like it's a worldview that's against them. Right? So they hold values in this really weird, contradictory way. Right? You could think of it as it's a fracturing of their self. Right? Like they learn, and there's a lot of like, and when you read Franz Fannon, there's a lot of these passages about self-hatred, right, that flow through it, right, and feelings of guilt associated with someone's blackness, right. And feelings of inferiority, right? If you absorb what white culture says about blackness, right, then essentially you're forced into this position of sort of like self-hatred, and that's his point. Right? And we can view that as a contrast to how we talked about dual consciousness in Collins, right? Or how we talked about dual consciousness, that idea that this master-slave dialectic in Hegel, if you remember back, right? Like, it's the complete opposite of that. Rather than this being a positive value, seeing both sides, it's instead the lack of a unified self, right? And so, like, whiteness is the privilege of having a unified, assumed worldview for Franz Fannon. There's another thing in here, and I wanted to talk about this. This has to do with the body and experiences in the body in the article. So if you go to page 13 in the article, there's this discussion of a philosopher by the name of Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty. So if you pick up, there's that second full paragraph. That's where I'm kind of looking at, and let's start from the following. The sentence that says following, it's about 4 lines down. So let me see where I'm at. Anybody want to jump in and read? Yeah, go ahead.
Following Merleau-Ponty, Fannon describes the bodily schema as the lived body by and through which one takes up the world. The body as lived is not the body as consciously reflected on. Such reflection has already turned the body into an object or thought. As lived, by contrast, we do not think our bodies through their various activities and movements. The body as lived is the unthought means by which I am an active agent in the world. As Fannon explains, a slow composition of myself as a body in the middle of a spatial and temporal world, such seems to be the bodily schema. It does not impose itself upon me, it is rather a definitive structuring of the self and of the world. Definitive because it creates a real dialect between my body and the world.
Okay. That's kind of a complicated statement, right? Just to give us a concrete example, jump down to where oh, actually you were already there. Just keep on going.
This schema can be seen in Fannon's example of his desire to smoke. When he reaches for matches and cigarettes, his movement toward the table and then the drawer are part of a lived situation that combines both body and world. Fannon does not think his arms and hands. It is successive steps of opening the drawer, falling out the matches, and lighting the cigarette. Rather, his body is composed of the implicit knowledge of how to accomplish his task by means of engagement with the socio-material objects of the world.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. So what's being said here? How do we experience our bodies? Bodies are different then. Another way to put it, how don't we experience our bodies? Most of the time. You guys ever heard the phrase muscle memory? What's muscle memory? How do people use that?
You just end up doing something so much that you do it subconsciously.
Yeah, it's that you no longer, so did anybody here ever, like, when you first start doing an activity, I used to be, when I was in high school, I used to be an archer. Like, that was the only sport that I did. Like, I did collegiate archery. I don't usually like sports, but collegiate archery was my kind of sport. Like, you didn't have to think fast. Right? Like, you could, if you pulled your arrow and then couldn't get the right shot and draw it down and waited, people would be like, "Good job!" Right? Like, it's the slowest sport ever. I love that. Way to be patient. Anyways, and like when I was like in archery, like when you first start shooting, you're really, really bad. But part of the reason you're really bad is because you think about what you're doing. You know, and you have to like learn to no longer think. Like if you think about putting an arrow someplace, you won't. But if you just pull and draw and use your muscle memory, your sort of instinct for it, then you'll actually do well, right? And so you think about like a lot of our bodily activities are like that, right? Like if we think about them, we're worse at them, right? Does it make sense? But most of what we do, and actually like on top of that we have all these sort of like things that don't really matter. What's Franz Fannon's example that he talks about? Smoking. And a bit dated, right? Most people. Did anyone here have any friends who smoke? So yeah, I've had a lot of friends who smoke through the years. Have you ever noticed like smokers, like they don't necessarily think about smoking when they're doing it? They're just sort of like sitting at the table and they'll do it without even like really like, it doesn't seem to phase the conversation at all. It just like keeps on flowing. That's kind of like Franz Fannon's example, right? So like his point is that most of the movements, just like that sort of like smoker who picks things up off the table, lights the cigarette without really like a second thought, right, is in essence like how we experience most of the time being in our body. That our being in our body is an unconscious thing. And it quotes Franz Fannon here, but Franz Fannon is at that moment explaining Merleau-Ponty, who's the person who has this idea, right, that embodiment is preconscious, right? That we experience our body at a preconscious level mostly. There's a significance to this, because we assume that our interaction with the world, right, is through our thoughts, right? This is sort of a baseline assumption of most people when we're talking philosophically. We assume, right, that our engagement with the world is that I think about it, I know it, and I understand it, and then I act. But does that describe most human action? No, most human action is unthought, right? It exists in a preconscious level. Which means that our moment where we bridge, right, ourself and our world, right, and this is kind of the point being made, the point where we bridge ourself and the world, where ourself really interacts. That's all that talk about the dialectic, right, the dialectical intertwining in this paragraph. All that's saying is that moment where ourself and the world becomes sort of combined is always through our body, right? And is largely not through our thoughts. In other words, we interact with the world mostly just through assumption and habit. Make sense? There's all these debates too that like, for those of you outside of sociology, have any of you guys ever heard of the word agency before? Sociologists love to use this word. So agency is an idea, is a question of like, can you act upon the world and alter it? Right? It's very similar to the idea of free will. In much the same way as are people familiar from your philosophy classes of the difference between like free will and determinism? No? Well, then we might as well just stick with structure and agency. So structure and agency. So agency is my ability to act upon the world. Structure is in essence like this the way in which what I do, what I think, what I say is structured by social institutions that surround me, my social environment, right? So there's always a tension in sociology. In sociology, like, if you go too far in one direction, you become like, basically, I do whatever I want. Social structure doesn't have any influence on it, which is pretty false. If you go too far the other direction, then the world becomes this sort of static, unchanging thing in which our actions have no consequences, because they're just sort of programmed by social structure, which is also obviously false. Monty Pinot is creating an idea about agency, right? So his point here is that if we think about the world through thought, it's hard to find our ability to act upon the world, right? So like, we can think about like all the ways in which, you know, we absorb messages, we inherit culture, you know, what we think, what we feel, what we believe is inherited from our families and people around us, or they're influenced by institutions that surround us, or they get to us through our media, right? So like if we're thinking about the world of thought, it's often hard to find agency. And what Merleau-Ponty is saying is if we focus on the body, then you can see agency, right? You act all the time, right? And this acting is not some sort of not preconditioned by the social structure, but preconditioned by your everyday life moving and interacting in the world, right? So you and the world don't have this clear divide from one another, but you're always influencing one another. That's why it uses the word dialectic. Is anybody here familiar with the word dialectic? It's a really important word in sociology. Dialectic is when you, rather than thinking in the world of opposites, you think of them as interacting, right? So like in sociology, a good example of this, right? So like if you're thinking like, anybody here take a psychology class before at all? Either in high school or college? Did you guys talk about nature versus nurture? Right? If you think about the world in a binary way, nature and nurture becomes this like, I do something, was it my biology or was it my environment, right? In sociology, we like to think about things dialectically. So the answer to that question, nature or nurture, would be yes, right? Because our bodies, our biology, right, and our culture, they mutually influence one another and change over time, right? So like, I exert upon the world, but the world exerts upon me. And we have to understand it as this exchange, right? Rather than these sort of static categories opposed to one another. Does it make sense? Okay, cool. So essentially that's what Merleau-Ponty is saying, is that you can see that agency in the body, right, and in an embodiment. There's a whole literature, like, he's one of the more famous philosophers from the 20th century because of this claim. Okay. So, did anybody catch, probably not, but how Franz Fannon takes qualm with this? For Franz Fannon, he's going to say that what Merleau-Ponty is saying is essentially influenced by his place in racial hierarchy. Much like we've already seen him using the Freudian concept of the unconscious, right? That Franz Fannon is critical of the idea of this sort of unproblematic unconscious that exists in one unified person. He's also a little hesitant of this idea of unaware embodiment for much the same reason. And so, to get us thinking about this, I'm going to leap us forward to page 15. And we're going to read his explanation, and then we're going to jump down and read an example that he has. If you look, this paragraph, it's the second full paragraph, it starts with the word to. It's on page 15. Raise your hand when you want to volunteer to read.
To have one's bodily horizon shattered, therefore, is to have one's ability to make meaning in the world severely damaged. Once shattered, the horizon of my body cannot serve as the unfocused upon background to my activities and projects in the world. The shattering of my bodily horizons means that my body itself stands out as an object in the world, no longer part of the vague fringe outside the focus of conscious attention. It is now concentrated upon, viewed as a thing rather than lived, as a crucial component of my agency. Bodily horizons can be shattered by a number of situations, but what is common to them all is that once destroyed, one's body is transformed into a thing to be manipulated rather than a means by and through which one lives.
Okay, what's being said here? How does this differ from what we were just talking about? This is him explaining, right, the difference in how someone of African descent would experience their body. How do they primarily experience their body? Somebody will get something longer, they stare at the paragraph. Yeah, go ahead.
That their bodies are viewed as a thing rather than like a component for agency.
Yeah. So essentially, his idea is that it flips. So why do you think it might flip? Why would it be that, according to Franz Fannon, people of African descent don't have this clearly embodied, unconscious way of moving through the world? We can think back to what. Do we remember where Franz Fannon, when we were talking about his previous idea, where he got the idea from? When he moved someplace? You guys remember this? So he grew up in the French colony of Martinique, right? Where did he end up going from there? Yeah, he moved to France, right? And then he became very aware that he was black. And why did he become aware that he was black? This is what Franz Fannon, in the moment of the fracturing of his conscience.
Because in France he was around almost all white people, not black people.
Yeah, in essence, like all of a sudden he was recognized as being black everywhere he went, right? In a place where it was very uncommon. So you think about like that experience, how would that change? How would that change the way you would think about your body? So you're in Martinique, you're walking around, right? You look like everybody else, no one reacts to you. How do you live, this is very similar to many of our experiences in our own communities, right? Like, how aware are you of the fact that you're white and that you move like a white person, that you act like a white person, right? How aware are you of that? Not very, right? Like actually, and it's very different because like whiteness is privileged, right? But like when I studied in Senegal, I became expressly aware of my own whiteness in a very different way. Because people reacted to you being white, because like if I went out to go get a drink or went out to like I don't know, see a reggae show or something like that, I was usually the only white person in the room, right? And people would come up to you and be like, so where are you from, right? People were very aware, people were friendly with me, and like in a lot of ways, like my whiteness was a mark of my own privilege, and people treated me as if I was a wealthy person most of the time, which was a novel experience for me. But nonetheless, I became very expressly aware. This is a lot more negative version of that same thing. So what he's saying is that for people who are minorities, like they don't have this sort of like free use of their body in the world that's an expression of their agency. Instead, they have to constantly be forced to think about their own bodies, right? Let's take another example. So the paragraph below, the one that we were just looking at. Did anyone catch this thing about Algerian women's veils? Okay, so if you go, this is about 4 lines down. I'm breaking up actually, if you go two lines down, there's a sentence that starts with the word just. Starts in the beginning. If we go down to the comma right before it says Fannon, you see where I'm at? Okay, great. Next volunteer to read. Yeah, go ahead.
Fannon understands that the Algerian woman's veil is not something foreign or external to her bodily schema. It is intrinsic to her lived body, crucial to the way in which she takes up her world. The attack of French occupational forces on Algerian culture by means of the unveiling of Algerian women was, therefore, an attack on Algerian women's bodies themselves. Newly unveiled, the Algerian woman's bodily schema was shattered. Her body became an object to consciously operate rather than the pre-reflective means by which she actively engaged the world. Fannon describes the difficulty the unveiled woman has doing something as simple as crossing the street. Without the veil, she has an impression of her body being cut up into bits, put adrift. The limbs seem to lengthen indefinitely. When the Algerian woman has to cross the street, for a long time she commits errors of judgment as to the exact distance to be negotiated, rather than be freed of something that most Western women would consider cumbersome. The unveiled Algerian woman is now burdened with the absence of her veil.
Okay, so what's happening here? What's the veil that's being talked about here, first of all? Does anybody know where Algeria is? Where's Algeria? It's in North Africa, right? Predominantly North Africa is religiously what? Muslim, yeah. So they're basically discussing Algerian women's veils. Algeria is a French colony as well, right, at the time. And actually, like, if you remember back, Franz Fannon was involved in the Algerian Revolution. That where they gained their freedom from France. But prior to that, right, generally, and we talked about this, the mise en valeur, the French policy, when we talked about white settler colonialism, which is essentially like France tried to transform every place it colonized into France, right? So this is about that policy to some degree. So like in transforming North Africa to France, what in this case do you think they're making illegal? Or what is it pointing to? What was France doing during its occupation of Algeria? What becomes illegal? This is actually illegal in France today. If you go in, at least going into public buildings.
Where are they?
Yeah. Even in, about 10 years ago, they outlawed this in France. You can't go into a public building with a Muslim veil on your face. It's against the law to go into public buildings in Muslim garb. So this is, an early policy where they unveil women. So how does Franz Fannon describing the experience of Algerian women when they're forced to remove their veils?
They feel like a part of themselves is missing, and so they have trouble doing things that they would regularly do because they actually see things differently without that.
Yeah, so it disturbs their bodily experience. Yeah, he describes it almost like it's just sort of become a part of their bodies, right? Their embodiment. There's something else here too. What does wearing a veil do? You may be able to associate with this now that you have to always wear a mask. How is wearing a mask different from?
You can't see their whole face.
You can't see their face, right? It makes your face what? Something private, right? So like, no one is allowed to look in your face. Actually, like I read an article not that long ago. People were harassing. I can't remember the pop singer, right? It was a British pop singer, and when she went to the Middle East, she did a tour in Saudi Arabia, and she wore the veil to be respectful to the people in Saudi Arabia, and she talked about how liberating it was not to have anybody looking at her face anymore. That if she went out in public, like not only did nobody know who she was, but even if they knew who she was, like nobody was thinking about her face. Like nobody was essentially like, and her point was nobody was sexualizing her when she would go out in public, right? So like in a lot of ways, like the veil, right? In a strange way, sort of is both, it can be in a weird way sort of liberating, right? It's the veil it keeps you from being objectified, right? Turned into an object. So like all of a sudden, like having to remove your veil, right? What happens to you?
You're exposed.
Yeah. So like, and this is, in a lot of ways, this is his sort of metaphor, right? So like this is a metaphor for him why this concept in general is problematic, right? So like, if you think about these Algerian women being forced to, because he's not just talking about Algerian women, this is like a larger treatise, right? But the example that he's giving here is if we take the Algerian women being forced to remove their veils as an idea, right? That if you're a minority, essentially what it's like when you're being unveiled, right? All of a sudden you become object. And your whole way of orienting towards the world slips from this sort of easy unconsciousness, right? The experience of a privileged embodiment to one in which like you are no longer easily unconscious. So he gives an example, like what was the example of something that he noticed Algerian women having a hard time doing without their veil? Because this is interesting because it's not something you would assume.
Crossing the street.
Yeah, that he finds that when they're forced to take off their veils, Muslim women had a hard time crossing the street. Right? Why? Why would that be? That's a weird thing, right? Because we don't think of a veil, like a veil over your face, as affecting your arms and your limbs. Why might that be?
Was it the idea that like the people in the cars, like when they cross the street, are looking at them?
It's not that linear. Like it's not that like immediate, causally.
One thing you said was that like basically they don't feel protected and like they can see themselves getting hit by a car. And like and he also said that they commit errors of judgment. Just the exact distances to be negotiated.
Yeah, so let's start with that quote. Let's reread that. The quote on page 16 in that paragraph we read. Starts with without.
Without the veil, she has an impression of her body being cut up into bits, put adrift. The limbs seem to lengthen indefinitely. And the Algerian woman has to cross the street. For a long time, she commits errors of judgment as to the exact distance to be negotiated.
Okay, so what's changed that causes that? Without the veil, she has an impression of her body being cut up into bits, put adrift. The limbs seem to lengthen indefinitely. He's being poetic, right? What is he saying about how she experiences her body? She experiences it, right? Really, that's kind of the point, right? So like you think about, like, you compare that, right? So there's the previous example we're getting from Fannon is smoking a cigarette. So think back to that smoker, the Merleau-Ponty, like, I act upon the world, right? I do it with ease. I do it unconsciously. How unconscious is she of her body when she has to take her veil off? Not at all, right? And so, like, his point is that, you know, when she removes her veil, that sort of, even the most simple task, right? Something completely disconnected from the veil becomes problematic because her entire way of envisioning herself and her body is altered because she is now object, right, rather than subject. Make sense? Okay, cool. Any other questions or thoughts? This is the other thing I wanted to make sure that we got to with the article. Is there any more questions? Any other questions or thoughts about Franz Fannon before we shift gears? Or about Merleau-Ponty, or about agency, or about any of that? Yeah.
So, Merleau-Ponty, was she saying that like agency and structure like work together, sort of?
It's so, like, usually when you're talking about dialectics, it's like dialectics is sort of like opposing forces, right? So, like, in a lot of ways, usually sociologists in general will think of it this way too. That, like, and a lot of times philosophy, just like when I talked about before, free will and determinism are thought about as opposing things in older forms of philosophy. Structure and agency are thought of as opposing things. So, like, my actions are limited by the social structure I live in, right? You can think about, like, my opportunity structure, what I have resources, like what my resources are, all these things are limiting factors that surround my life. What institutions I belong to, right? Like, if you belong to one institution, you have one form of power, it doesn't necessarily translate, you know. I have the ability to, like, you know, do things like shape discourse because I'm an academic, right? So, like, I can publish things. If you don't belong to a college, you can't publish. Do people know this? This is kind of like a weird, like, you see the power of the institution here. If you don't have an affiliation, is the term that they use in academia. If you don't have an academic affiliation, you can't publish peer-reviewed journals, right? So anybody off the street can't publish that, right? You have to have a degree, basically. So you think about that, that's one form of power, but I have not a lot of money, so I can't really influence business, right? I can't, like, send troops someplace, so I don't have any form of military power, right? So what institutions we've oriented ourselves to, right, affect what we can and can't do. So if you want to think about it that way, like, structure is basically how those institutions create restraints as well as opportunities on my agency. So they're often thought of as opposing forces. So sociologists will usually think of it as, like, we act against social structure, right, to enact change. Social structure wants to replicate itself over time. It wants things to stay the same. And within the context of our class, right, when we want to think about structure and agency, we've been talking a lot about structure when it comes to race, right? So we've been looking a lot at, like, how is it that there are institutions that constrain the opportunities, what can be done surrounding race, right? The other end, and we're going to take 1 week and look at social movements, is the question of how do you use your agency to alter that, right? But they're viewed as opposing forces, right? Structure wants to stay racist, even to the point where when we got into, like, Benia Silva, right? Like, structure wants to stay racist, and even if people aren't racist, structure will stay that way, right? And us doing nothing sort of perpetuates it. Trying to positively enact change, that can alter, right, racial structure. But that has to be an agented action. It has to come from a sense of agency. Make sense? Other thoughts and questions? great, we'll plunge forward then. Let's talk about whiteness. I think to get us started on whiteness, I want us to look at, because the other one's kind of like a critique of whiteness studies in a lot of ways, so I want us to start with the Penelope Ingram's Racializing Babylon, White Settlers, and the New Racism. And so what we're going to see in this article is it's going to discuss, and this is what I want to try to get through for today, it's going to discuss traditionally how whiteness is talked about, particularly starting in the 80s with somebody by the name of Richard Dyer. And like, which is before that, and this is, we can kind of feel this in this class, when we talk about race, who do we normally talk about? So if we talk in politics about race, we talk, what's that? You talk about minorities, right? You don't talk about white people. And essentially Richard Dyer's idea is that there's a weird blind spot to how power works, right? That is constructed through not looking at how is whiteness structured, right? Because the power of white people, the dominance of white people, has a lot to do with how, as a culture, we envision whiteness. So basically, his idea is almost like by not thinking about whiteness, we help to replicate racial structure. And we'll see why that is. In general, this literature is referred to as whiteness studies. So that's so we're looking this week specifically at whiteness studies. The first spot I want us to start with is, in fact, Richard Dyer. His discussion of Richard Dyer. This starts on page 158. So it's the first full paragraph in white. Which, whenever, and this is just an aside, whenever people talk about Dyer, he has two different publications, both of which are called White, which is really confusing. So he has a book called White and an article called White, and they're not the same thing. Anyways, go ahead. Anybody want to read? Oh, you read last. You get these.
In Whiteness, his study of white representation, Richard Dyer analyzes precisely this tendency for whiteness to be represented as unmarked or unraced in filmic and photographic representations in this century. Dyer explains that in these media, white bodies are lit in such a way as to appear translucent, thereby assuming a spiritual aura perpetuated by Christian iconography. What Morrison and Dyer demonstrate then is that in film and literature, as well as other media, whiteness triumphs both thematically, it is uplifting, noble, universal, and pure, whereas blackness is represented as demonic, unholy, downtrodden, dirty, and aesthetically through the codes employed by the respective media in their representations of whiteness. Thus, whiteness is not simply represented as universal, pure, true, and so on. It is habitually constructed as such through the textual and aesthetic codes deployed by these media, which in turn establish and propagate these kinds of representations as truths. As Dyer makes clear, the aesthetic technology of the photographic media, the apparatus and practice par excellence of a light culture, not only assumes and privileges whiteness, but also constructs it.
Okay, so what is so what's the first part of our construction of whiteness here? What is white? What is Dyer saying about whiteness and its betrayal? Yeah.
He's kind of like talking about that whiteness is like showing something that is like good and like noble and that is like white and good, too pure, and like clean cut and stuff like that, I guess.
Yeah. So he talks about in some ways white is often thought of and portrayed as something pure. There's another word that gets used here. Dyer, where it says Dyer explains that in these media white bodies are lit in such a way as to appear translucent. There's a significance to that. What does it mean to be translucent?
Angelic, or can do no wrong.
Let's think about literally the word. What does the word translucent mean?
Does it mean see-through?
Yeah. So we're portrayed as pure, innocent, right, holy, but we're also portrayed as translucent, as see-through. So Dyer is a film critic, if you didn't pick up on that, right? And so the section that they're quoting from White, what you have Dyer saying is in essence that there's a weird thing that happens in film. And you can actually, like, literally, now that I bring this up, when you watch a movie, you can literally see this. So every time somebody, does anybody know where you usually light from? Anybody here do theater or film stuff at all? Lights usually come from above. Oh, sorry, you were itching. I thought you were pretty. So literally, like, most of the time, right, light shines from above, right? So like if you think about it, you have your film camera here, right? So literally, like, people will be shot from above. What does being shot from above do? Well, when you have light coming from above, it makes somebody's complexion lighter, right? And it also makes, like, and you think about, like, there's sort of standard, sort of like soft focusy, kind of like old-timey shot, right? Like sun shining through the hair, right? Like, and his point is like you have this very, like, translucent figure often being produced from being shot from above. Not everyone is shot from above, right? Every time in film an African American is shot, or somebody with black skin is shot, they're shot from below. This is why often they will not put black people next to white people in movies. So if you ever notice in movies, they will often, rather than have like a scene where it's two people talking and they're both in the same frame, often when they have people of African descent speak to people of white descent, they'll shoot back and forth between the faces. And the reason why is because of this difficulty in terms of the lighting, right? Now there's a reason why they do that, right? And the reason why they do that is in essence because, actually I should have put the camera here, the light here. But the reason why they do that, according to Dyer, has to do with the camera technology. But in some ways he would argue that we, in essence, like, created cameras capable of picking up white faces. So it's actually like a weird feedback. But anyways, the point is what the result of this becomes that we sort of envision, right, them as pure, holy, and most significantly as we move on, translucent. Okay. All that makes sense? Any questions or thoughts about that? This becomes even more true if you watch anything made before the digital era. So if you watch older movies, it's even more true that you get this very clear dichotomy in how people are shot. It means that Jews can never really see black faces very well on screen. Okay, let's start with, let's go ahead and start with the next paragraph. I have us immediately jump down to the next one. This is where it says, like Ruth Frankenberg.
Like Ruth Frankenberg in her study, White Women, Race Matters,
Dyer contends that white people consider themselves to have no race. They are just human. Racial others are expected to speak and have knowledge only of their own race. White people, on the contrary, have assumed the privilege of speaking for the human race. Dyer and others have argued that this unraced quality of whiteness enables and perpetuates white privilege. Because they are ostensibly without race, not simply one race among many, whites have come to represent the standard against which all else is defined.
Okay, let's pause there. So what's being said here? What's the difference between white and other races of people? And this ties into where we started, right? That there's something problematic to only talking about minorities when we talk about race. What do we already assume about whiteness?
It's basically saying that whiteness is like the norm and everything else is something different.
Yeah, well, yeah. So one is that whiteness allows itself to become the norm for everything else. And we can think back to like when we were talking about colonialism, right? And we talked about this weird contradiction. Do you guys remember this? That like Western societies, like they talk about like themselves as democratic, free, right? But then they like essentially hate on everyone else and exclude everybody else in the world, right? So like when our forefathers talk about having democracy in which all men have the right to vote, they say mean all men except for anyone who's not white and doesn't own property, right? So there's a weird exclusionary thing that happens with whiteness, right? In which whiteness comes to represent all of humanity at once. So usually, actually, if you're reading anything, especially from the past, or even today usually, right? And you're reading and somebody talks inclusively about humanity, 80% of the time, they're actually just going to mean white people. Right? So white people allow themselves to be, or have the power of being basically the representatives of humanity itself, right? The neutral, right? Which is tied in, right, with the imagery, right? It's saying the same thing in a lot of ways, right? That's why our author is bringing up both of these. Okay, there's something else here in this paragraph. This little section that we just read. Something else we need to pull out.
They talk about how, like, white people don't really consider white being a race. They just consider it being human.
Yeah, it's a race that's no race at all. Right? That's one of Dyer's phrases. Whiteness is a race that's no race at all. This is the mechanism by which whiteness is allowed to represent all of humanity. We assume, another way that he puts it is, Dyer, well, I just like Dyer's poetic phrases a little more than, so Dyer will talk about it as whiteness is everything and nothing all at once. Whiteness is everything and nothing. Right? It's allowed to represent everybody in humanity. It's allowed to be everything because we don't see it as a race. When in reality, the joke is that whiteness is a race. So things that white people do are cultural. They're ethnic. Right? We have our own ethnicity. But, right, we aren't aware of it. Right? We allow ourselves that sort of like, or we create for ourselves this world in which we are not actually a race. Right? For Dyer, this is actually why white people refer to themselves as white. Because are white people white? Does the term white actually describe what white people look like? Not really, right? Have you ever seen a white person who is actually white? What color are we really? or I shouldn't say we, but what color are white people really? What color is white skin?
Like a beige.
Yeah, it's like this beige to pink, maybe a little tan, right? Dyer's like, we don't call white people white because they have white skin. Like, white is actually a reference to our category, right? Because what is the color white? And then I think he's also just being poetic here, so just take it for what it is, right? Like, does anybody know anything about white and other colors? There's two things that produce whiteness, color-wise. So, anybody here take painting class, take art in high school? Nobody here has ever mixed paint before? How do you get white paint? Anybody here ever paint a wall? So you're going to change colors. What do you paint the wall first? White. Why do you paint it white? And paint white is what? It's the absence of pigment, right? It's a negative category, that it's nothing, right? On the other end, like when you talk about color spectrum, what is white? So if we're talking about light rather than paint. Think back to high school. You know how you guys are going to be school teachers. Don't you have to take classes on like what you're going to teach in high school science? This is a high school science thing right here. Elementary school, Roy G. Bibb, right? Nobody knows what I'm referring to. On the spectrum of light, what is white? It's also everything. It's all the colors at once, right? White light is all colors of light, right? So like, getting back to like, the point is that like he wants to claim to some degree like whiteness is neutral, right? And that's why we actually refer to white people as being white, is because white people are actually think of themselves as neutral. It's not a statement about skin color, right? In a lot of ways, white people view themselves as not having a skin color. We could go back to Franz Fannon again, right? You know, our embodied experience is one in which we view ourselves as neutral. All that makes sense so far? Any questions or thoughts about whiteness so far? Yeah.
Do you think like maybe that's kind of like how some people say like, oh, white's not even a color? Like would that kind of relate to that?
Yeah. And so if you just want to think about that, that's more of like a good like way of thinking about it, right? More than I think it is something that like social scientifically, right? Is like, yeah, like whiteness isn't a color, right? And we even refer to, like, if you think about, like, in divisions, right, we often will refer to any group of minority as, you know, as people of color, right? Implying, right, once again, that white people are not a people of color, right? That we don't have an ethnicity or a race, right? So how practically, what's the issue here? Like, if we're talking about in terms of, like, so, like, we're bringing this up where this is, like, in some ways, like, whiteness studies is still supposed to be critical, right, if you didn't catch on to this, right? What's the significance of this fact, socially speaking? How does this alter the way we think about, and we can also think about this, like the whiteness studies of stuff becomes in some ways kind of similar to the colorblind racism stuff in this. What's the significance of white people being able to being raceless in our thoughts, representing all of humanity? What's the difficulty in terms of the institutions that surround us? Yeah.
What is defined as like morals in white cultures should then be the moral standard for the rest of the world.
Yeah. Yeah, it allows, did you have something else? I thought I saw a hand over here someplace. Yeah, did you want to share too?
I was kind of gonna say something similar to that, but
Yeah.
like there's in colorblindness, we talked about how it doesn't recognize the issues that persist among other minority communities, kind of, and it's kind of saying the same thing here.
Yeah, and I think those things are intertwined in the world of whiteness studies, right? So like, yeah, like we have a baseline assumption that everybody could or should do the things that, and we can view this as like sort of like written into the laws. There's a lot of like statutes and so on and so forth that actually represent very much so white values. You could think about like if you were to take things like intoxicants that people use, whether they're white or black, and sort of like figure out which ones are which, you'll find that people who are drugs that are used more commonly by black people hold longer prison sentences than those by white people. And this is a study in the 1980s found this, right? Part of that is that essentially our reaction to those things, right? White people's reactions to those things color the law that gets created. But it's not because anybody sat to go out and was like, we're gonna make all the things that black people do illegal, right? Or more harshly illegal, right? We instead just simply felt differently about it and assumed that that was somehow universal, right? And when you think about like a lot of the behaviors, like even things like that we code in our minds as being like bad. I remember reading a study once about people's attitudes about neighborhoods on the basis of whether people put indoor furniture outside. Right? So like for people who are middle class and white, one of your major cues about whether a neighborhood is safe or not has to do with whether it has indoor furniture outside. Right? Which actually has like this long history of like who had access to like air conditioning. So like why would you put, so again, you guys know what I'm referring to. It's like things like if people have like a recliner or a couch out on their porch, right? Which, does anybody have any feelings about that? Like, would you put an indoor couch outside and sit on it? But if you go to poorer neighborhoods, somewhat regardless of race, you'll often see this, right? Like where people will, I used to have a porch couch. I used to live in kind of a poor neighborhood, but I used to have a porch couch. It's actually quite nice, you go out on the porch, sit down. It was like plastic couch, so it didn't get wet or anything, right? And, but anyways, like if people drive by that, right, in essence, they'll look at this and they'll be like, oh, this is a gross place, right? Like these people with these outdoor furniture. But historically, right, who is capable of staying inside during the summer and staying cool? Does anybody here ever live in an unair-conditioned home? So like in the summer, how long do you get of being comfortable inside before like things get really gross inside and nicer outside? I think like 4 or 5 days in the 90s, and then all of a sudden like it's unbearably hot inside. It's like 100 degrees inside, and you're just like, let me outside, right? So you think about for a long time when like access to air conditioning was determined by your social class, right? Poor people were more likely to have things outside that they could sit on and be comfortable with, right? So because they spent more time outside. But culturally, like even though there's not like a sanitation issue or anything weird, right? We make that distinction in our mind and we code it, right? So then we have this value system that allows us, right, to essentially judge other places, right? Baseline underneath that value system is this sort of neutrality, right? This idea that however I react to something, everyone else should react to that the same way, right? This is not a privilege that other people of other races, according to whiteness studies, has, right? So our world becomes defined because of our difference in power, white people's ability to, if you will, whitewash the world, right? Okay, I think we're out of time. Yeah, we're out of time. So we're going to pick up and we're going to see, so both of our articles alter this basic idea, right? So we're going to start with this basic idea, and then we're going to see how the two articles we have elaborate upon it, change it, to fit other situations of being white.